Begin in a moment. There's an echo. Yeah, Daniel, I do think you're gonna have to wear headphones. I think the echo will come through, yeah, on the Substack. Thanks for letting us know on there. Great. Okay, so we are live on YouTube as well, and that's great.
That's better.
Great. Here we are. Amazing. Great. Everyone on Zoom, thank you for your patience while we figured out yet another complicated streaming scenario, but we seem to have done it, so all good. Let us know how you're doing in the chat. It'd be nice to do a quick check-in so we all have a sense of actually also maybe say where you are in the world. That's always a nice thing to do so we get a sense of the breadth that we have in the space. And actually, people in Substack, why don't you let everyone know the same? Where are you in the world? Right. So, while these lovely messages are coming through, um, Northampton, Oxford. Okay, the first two were just in the UK and not that. Okay, Los Angeles. We've got Boulder, Colorado, Poland, Spain, Norway, Mexico, London. Amazing. I'm in London. Daniel, where are you based?
New York City.
New York City. Awesome. So, welcome back, uh, everyone. I'm going to just start recording. There's like a million different things to think of at the same time. Great. So, welcome back, everyone. This is the third ever live conversation hosted on Kainos, and very pleased to be joined by Daniel Pinchbeck, someone whose work I've admired for many years. So, I'll give Daniel a proper introduction in a moment. But I wanted to just contextualize what these conversations are about and really what Kainos is about before we launch in. So, really the intention, maybe I'll start with Kainos, is to combine cultural sense making and the question of basically what the hell is going on in the world with a deeper sense of who are we and where are we going and why as humans. And so the what felt very natural as a place to begin that inquiry was just a question that kept coming to my mind over the last few months with the big political and cultural changes we've seen, certainly in the US with the re-election of Donald Trump, but also in here in Europe. We have a kind of increasing sense that the liberal world order, so that's the kind of political and social ideas that arose after World War II in particular. Their roots are go much further back, and perhaps we'll even touch on that today. But this sense of a sort of a global community and a celebration of multiculturalism and kind of an idea that national borders in particular and national interests and localized interests are ultimately less important than a sense of kind of global connectivity. Now, that idea, I think, is really being challenged very heavily by many different factors. And one of those factors, some of the factors are very practical, like, large scale immigration in Europe and the US. Immigration is a hot political
By the way,
topic. And
Alex,
yeah,
people are still having an echo problem. I'm not sure what we
oh, they're
do about
having
it.
an echo problem. I wonder why. Let's see. How is that? Still hearing it?
What, I wonder if I mute when I'm not speaking.
Let's try
Maybe
that. Why
that'll
don't
help.
you mute? Okay, so Daniel's muted. Um, can you guys still hear the echo in Substack? Is that better?
No, there's still an echo.
There's still an echo. That's very strange. There's still an echo. Okay, that's very strange. Let's try this. All right. So how about now? Is there still an echo now or no echo?
No echo.
No echo. Yeah, let's just double check. People on Substack, any echo? People on Zoom?
Echo.
No echo. Okay, excellent. Fixed it. Thank you very much for letting us know that. So let me cover that again without the annoying echo. So, yeah, so the question that's been on my mind, particularly since the election of Trump, but also from the large political changes in in Europe, and well, certainly that's my reference point in Europe. Um, there is this significant shift from a the idea of a multicultural world to something that, in some expressions, is very traditionalist, very much a return to localized national interests, and in other cases, manifests as a desire to return to the land, or desire to return to the body. So it expresses itself in a lot of different ways, and I'm very curious about that intersection. We can talk about localization in terms of returning to traditional Christian values, as is happening in the States, or there's plenty of more animistic hippies who would talk about returning back to the body, back to the land, back to sustaining ourselves from our local area rather than large global supply chains. So, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to Daniel is that I think, Daniel, you've been writing a
Only
lot
the
about.
echo is
Yeah, the echo's back. Oh dear.
the
Okay.
echo is back on Substack.
Okay. I don't know what we're going to do about that. Let's see. Okay. So, guys, on Substack, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Daniel a question. I'm going to mute myself, and hopefully that will help. But yeah, so Daniel, let's just launch into that. So, Daniel, and I'm sorry for the echo for this bit again, but Daniel, you've been writing a lot about the election of Trump and your feelings about that, which I would think is safe to say are not positive. And I'm very curious to just to get a very simple question to start with. Why don't you feel positive about the re-election of Donald Trump?
Why don't I feel positive about the reelection of Donald Trump? Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of a staggering question. But yeah, it feels, like what are the main reasons? I mean, first of all, Tom Hartman and Greg Palast have been covering the amount of voter suppression in the US, which seems that it was well over 3.5 million votes. So, there's not a strong sense that the will of the people was actually heard in this case. And Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a despotic agenda. Trump has, had a whole career as a kind of, grifter, con artist. A lot of his enterprises have been fraudulent or have, sort of duped gullible people, whether it's like Trump Steaks or Trump University or Trump Coin. It feels like a huge step back into a kind of regressive form of politics. And even the way he is just cruel and nasty about, immigrants, all of the lies, all the felony convictions. So all that on like a personal level. And then in terms of what he represents politically, yeah, I'm very concerned that we are entering into a kind of prolonged, kind of totalitarian, autocratic situation. I think there's a lot of echoes with 1930s Germany, demonization of minorities or outsiders or othering, kind of ability, the effort to kind of aggregate power under, the executive branch, the kowtowing to him by the technocratic oligarchs, the capitulation by the mainstream media, which happened very quickly, where they don't even want to deal with like lawsuits and so on. The monopoly control of media and technology. So you have Larry Ellison, who's not only a major investor in TikTok or X, also is basically taking over monopoly control of Paramount, which includes CBS. And also Trump is trying to see if maybe Ellison will take over TikTok. So this is like, in a way, Elon Musk, seems to have some parallels to kind of like Goebbels, in sort of like this, kind of consolidating state and corporate power around a ideology that in the US's situation has a lot of, white Christian nationalist elements to it. If you go into Elon Musk's past, which I did some deep dives on, his grandfather was part of this political movement, Technocracy Inc., which wanted to see a future of no democratic control, where you had scientists and engineers in charge of the world. And there were basically three big technates: North America, from Canada, Greenland, down through Mexico, Central America, and Eurasia. And Asia, and each of these technates would be under the control of one sort of dictator engineer type. And it seems pretty clear at this point that Musk sort of feels that he's fulfilling this destiny of his family. And then the more you study into his character, unfortunately, because he's like, in terms of me personally having some connections to people in power, I actually have a lot of friends who, through Burning Man and the transformational culture in the Silicon Valley world, who have been quite, close to Musk over many years. So it's unfortunate, to see that. Yeah, whatever he's become, and whatever social media has done to what was already latent in his psyche and his personality, he seems now to be embracing, pretty much a neo-Nazi ideology. I mean, using dog whistles to certain people, and there's so many things that are very weird about this whole situation for me. I mean, Peter Thiel is kind of like the sort of power behind the throne in a way, because his protege JD Vance is now the vice president. It's quite possible that Vance is already pretty much calling the shots of the U.S. And yeah, but I went and read the book by the Heritage Foundation president Kevin Roberts. I think it's called America Early Dawn, or something about they're burning down America to save it or something. And that was a bracing read in terms of kind of a future that they see focused on, kind of family and patriotism, and a very particular idea of what Christianity is, or this kind of, their kind of God form archetype, which feels very regressive to me. Um, so yeah, they want to, do away with abortion on a national level, terrorize, gay and lesbian people, terrorize trans people. I mean, terrorize illegal immigrants, who actually do a lot of the functional work in the U.S. I mean, it's just like, yeah, I'm surprised by the level of, considering that it's powered by people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, who've been given so much by the system and had such incredible largesse from the government, and basically were the beneficiaries of the internet, which was created by taxpayer money, that these people who are worth, billions and billions of dollars, now see it in their purview to, not only, I mean, they, and nobody's stopping them from buying some islands, having their little private libertarian cities or whatever, but to actually want to like really kind of like take over the world in this way, with an ideology that to me is so reprehensible, to be honest, so negative, so against human values and human freedom and empathy and care and compassion. I'm very upset by it, and I'm also very upset by what I've seen, even in the, kind of the kind of people that I know in my expanded circle of connection, some who've become Trump and MAGA supporters, as a result of, let's say, the filter bubble effect on Facebook. I mean, you can almost feel as if their minds have been co-opted by a kind of alien philosophy. And yeah, a huge amount of money has gone into kind of like using social media and media generally as a weapon. And we can trace back through American history. So I can keep going on. You can stop me at any time, but I can go
Yeah,
for.
yeah, yeah. Let's jump in. I
I
think
mean,
you've laid. Yeah. Is there anything you want to add finally, or
that's fine.
yeah, yeah. So let's just check the echo, because I think I fixed it. It was my fault entirely from where the sound was coming through. Just on Substack, let's just double check that as I'm speaking now. You're okay. Um. Yep. It seems no one's complaining, so that's fine. There is an echo. Someone's saying that's frustrating. Um. There we go. Okay. I don't know what to do about that. I'm going to keep talking. Sounds good. Okay, fine. So, um, I'm going to play devil's advocate, Daniel, because I agree with you in terms of I'm not a fan of Trump or of Musk, but I am very critical of the sort of deep technocratic type of governance that at least some people in that sphere are reacting against. Um, so I'm going to move that back. Yeah, annoyingly, this echo seems to just not want to go away, and we'll just have to deal with it. The Yeah, so There is, I think, as someone who's written so much about counterculture, and we're both sort of in the psychedelic world and have an interest in sort of breaking through, oppressive systems. I think a lot of people who voted for Trump and a lot of the, let's say, the intellectual foundations of at least some of the pushback against progressivism has been based on the sense that there is an incredibly oppressive, mind controlling aspect of the worldview that developed from, say, 2014 to about this year, which tried to kind of force a particular idea of progress down people's throats, whether it was through Hollywood movies, whether it was in HR rooms, whether it was in universities, and that there is so my premise is that there's a really valid case to be made that pushing back against that system, which is sort of manifest in the economic system we have, it's sort of encapsulated by something like Davos. And as I understand it, recently Davos was very, not as well attended as normally. The energy was very low. There's a particular kind of power structure that, on one level, Trump, Brexit, a lot of the movements happening in Europe are pushing against because it is itself oppressive. Now, I think the complexity is that the alternative is also oppressive. So I'm not suggesting that the cure is any necessarily better than what we're facing, but I just wanted to sort of present that and see how it lands with you. Like the possibility that actually what we've just what this sort of revolutionary energy has been trying to destroy was also quite an oppressive, unfair system.
Sure. I mean, I sympathize with that. I mean, I never identified with the establishment Democrats. Couldn't stand Obama. I feel that they've been shills for, kind of corporate state. I mean, Obama's principal role was to, make sure that none of the bankers who crashed the financial system in 2008 had to ever pay any penalty whatsoever. And there's so many simple things that the Democrats could have done that would have basically ensured them mass popular support. For instance, raising the minimum wage, or creating a better healthcare system, like a where people are guaranteed health care. So the fact that they didn't do this shows that they were completely, kind of conscripted into this sort of like, Byzantine corporate system. And it was, the whole Kamala Harris campaign was painful to listen to this person because you could see that every time she spoke, it was like focus grouped and no, I can't use this word and I can't appear this aggressive because then this group of people won't like me. And if I, so it was just like, yeah, the Democrats are painful, and so I mean, I'm not for the Democrats. Is this far worse? And also, is it far worse? And even in all of those areas that you named, I think it's going to be like incredibly worse. I mean, I don't think that they really believe in freedom of speech. I mean, Musk is already, basically he has a control panel on X where he can turn anybody up or down as he likes, whenever he wants. So, for instance, I did an interview recently with Laura Loomer, who's a MAGA, she was like an extreme MAGA supporter who then realized that, Musk and these other guys were supporting the H-1B1 visas, which was a way for the tech oligarchs to have these kind of indentured servants from other countries who work at relatively low wages and can't speak up because they immediately get, thrown out of the country. So that when Musk took over Twitter and he fired most of the employees, he kept the H-1B1 visa people because they couldn't go against any of his, what he wanted to do with the algorithms and so on. So she brought up, that, the H-1B1 visas were a problem and caused a whole, mass kerfluffle on Twitter. And one of the first things Musk did is he took away her blue check mark. She was making 27,000 a month through her paid subscribers, which was her income. So he took away her income. Now she was part of this MAGA community who believed that, believed Musk that he was working with Trump. He was a free speech absolutist, and now they had the freedom to say whatever they wanted, and so on and so on. So then she suddenly realized that this is just as negative a situation as the previous one. Now, if you look at Larry Ellison, for instance, Larry Ellison has said repeatedly that what he wants to do in the US is create a AI-powered digital surveillance system that will keep the entire population on its best behavior. Okay. So there's no distant difference between what he's talking about and what we see in China with the social credit system. And also, whereas the Democrats and the liberals, as weak and annoying as they were, I personally never felt that due to my own writing, my own journalism, my own thinking, I was liable to go to prison or be, hurt in some way. I'm now very concerned about the future, looking past, maybe the next year or two, and I think for good reason. Another book that I studied in depth was a book called Unhumans, written by a MAGA right-wing nationalist, Jack Posobiec. And in that book, well, first of all, the book is blurbed by Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, who say that this is the right plan for America. It's a good plan. They praise the book. And the book basically says that the model for America's future are people like Franco and Pinochet. And it even says like famous helicopter killings of Pinochet, that's the kind of thing we should do. We should be taking liberals, dissidents, people who don't go along with the prevailing ideology, and we should throw them out of helicopters. And you have the vice president and president of the US now saying, yes, that's a good plan. Now, you could say it's our karma coming back to haunt us, because certainly the US has been a very bad actor often on the global stage. And in fact, we propped up Pinochet. We were the ones who destroyed the democratic elected government in Iran. That was Mossadegh in 1952, because he wanted to nationalize Iranians' oil and keep the profits for their people. We didn't allow that. So that led to the Shah, which ultimately led to a popular revolution, which led to Iranian fundamentalism. That was the US, kind of doing its thing. So a lot of what's happened in the world is, yeah, America has been very responsible for, and also we were the great power, since the 40s and so on. So you could say it's the karma of our country, but the problem is that if the country goes full Pinochet, full Franco, full Nazi, which I don't see much that's stopping it going in the direction at this point, there isn't another America waiting in the wings to come in and like change the situation, right? Like when Nazi Germany went insane and started killing everybody and attacking everybody, ultimately America could come across the water and kick its ass in a way. Now there's no other America waiting. So if America goes down this tunnel, I don't see what is going to pull it up. And I don't, and we can see with Musk and what he's doing with far right country, parties around the world, like they're really very interested to, so okay, we can go on. Somebody had a good question there. I don't want to belabor, but you asked me why I think this is different than, why I don't think it was a good idea that Trump won, or how. I mean, yeah. So the positive side, which I've also already written about, is sure. The system was broken. Maybe it needed to be smashed up. Unfortunately, generally, when we look around in the world and we see that the systems get smashed up in this way, it's generations to put it back together. And, they haven't even gotten started yet. I mean, they're planning to clean the whole house of the government, the civil servants, to appoint, white Christian nationalists who want control of women's bodies, who want to demonize minorities and so on. So, yeah, we could say that, maybe this breakdown was necessary. What we don't really have at this point, and I read all these, radicals and all the people on Substack who are like, and we're going to build this movement, we're going to do something. Well, I don't really see it at this point. Like, I don't see that happening under the Democratic aegis, maybe the Sunrise Movement, but whatever that is, I feel we need to start moving in that direction.
Mm. Yeah, that's where I'd like to pick up. I mean, there's two things I'd like to pick up on. One is this framing that I found very useful from Yanis Varoufakis, who, if people aren't familiar with him, he was the finance minister of Greece during the 2008 crash, right? So it was kind of, and Greece had defaulted, so it was kind of Greece versus the rest of the EU in some ways. Describes himself as I think, libertarian, sort of anarchist communist, effectively. But he has a book that came out last year, which I've written about recently, called Technofeudalism. Someone's put it in the chat. I think it's an incredibly useful frame, because I think what we've seen with Musk and Trump and that kind of uncomfortable alliance and the complete falsity of a real desire for free speech. It's a ludicrous sort of ideal when someone controls the entire commons, like on X, for example. What we've seen, especially with the tension around the visas with Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, is this division between a kind of more working class focused type of politics. I hate the word populism because I think democracy should be populist. I find it actually kind of a derogatory term that's been used by technocratic elites, but for want of a better term, a kind of populist energy that's focused on addressing the imbalance between elite interests and working class interests, and then an extremely wealthy technocratic elite who, Varoufakis argues capitalism is actually over because really what's happened is that the commons, so, now not the land, but the internet and the data that we're producing have been captured by particular fiefdoms, sort of feudal lords who control like Amazon, Alibaba, Meta, and that in some sense, 99% of us are serving these feudal lords, which is why when Luigi Mangione killed Brian Thompson, it was a fascinating moment of what I call breach, where something inherent in the collective psyche breaches out into the real world from the internet, because I've never seen that level of cohesion among left and right ever since I've been, doing this. Even Ben Shapiro, who's about as conservative as you can get, he did something like trashing Mangione, being like, people shouldn't be celebrating this guy. And the comment section of that video was people being like, yeah, you're wrong about this, Ben. You're just flat out wrong. And I mean, he got ratioed by his own audience very intensely. Very rare thing to see, right? In that kind of echo chamber. And I think it's a breach because it touches on something that the real battle now is between elites and non-elites, right? And someone mentioned again in the Substack, Peter Turchin's work, which I think you're familiar with as well, the idea that social transformation or social unrest happens when we have this too many elites, not enough places, and then the counter elites form. Trump is a counter elite. Mangione is a counter elite. He's from quite a wealthy family. And their interests align with the sort of disenfranchised many. Now, I think Turchin's analysis is quite accurate in many ways. But I want to just take that idea and come back into what you just mentioned, that there's right now, we don't have a counterculture to respond to what's going on. There isn't really a counterculture. And I actually would place some of the blame on that, on the cultural air, like the cultural feeling of the last 10 years, which was very captured by social justice ideology. So the art world was captured, Hollywood was captured, HR rooms were captured, corporate messaging was captured. Now you see this kind of rejection of it by the mainstream. Many of us were critical of it. And also I want to just note, and this is a piece I'm going to write soon, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater around postmodernism and, quote unquote, woke ideology, because there's a lot of deep value and understanding of power structures and how people are disenfranchised in that. So I want to just caveat that. But this is the next thing I wanted to ask you about. We're in this situation where there's a void for response, for a kind of a countercultural response. So where do you see the beginnings of that countercultural response happening right now? Where could they happen?
Wow, that was a good riff. I followed you down a lot of those pathways. I learned about the Peter Turchin book through your essay on Mangione, which I really enjoyed, and I reached out to you after that. And yeah, Technofeudalism I also read and was fascinated by. Um, I mean, I've always, maintained an interest, which a lot of like kind of I'm part of the Alexander group, the what are the Alexander uh, dark web intellectuals. So anyway, they always scoff at Antonio Negri and Michael Hart, political philosophers who wrote like Multitude and Empire. But there are some interesting ideas that I think could become relevant. I mean, so basically Negri and Hart, yeah, well, first of all, I mean, I think that book still has a lot of really cool and valuable ideas. And they talk about how the most important form of production in post-industrial society is the production of subjectivity or subjectivities, rather than the production of stuff. So I think that's something that's become, pretty obvious. And they also said that, Marx had put his faith in the proletariat as a kind of like potentially revolutionary subject. And obviously they've gotten us to a certain point, maybe to the New Deal and unionization and liberal democracies. But, we needed like a new revolutionary kind of agent or subject or whatever. And as you say, Turchin talked about the counter elites from the parts of the elites who get left behind. In that book, they had this concept of multitude, which essentially knowledge workers who can be easily marginalized or franchised. And so in a way, what we sort of like, hope, I don't know, but I mean, there are many ways in which this current techno-feudal, fascist regime could overstep in ways that will cost them greatly and will allow for a whole other sectors of society to self-identify in a different way. What is the the visa question, and kind of like if people start seeing things in terms of working class people start seeing things in terms of class rather than race again, that's a big deal. And that's something that I think should be made as apparent as possible to people. They're not seeing it for the most part in that way right now because the ideological capture, particularly of the right-wing media, is such a powerful force in the society. Um, but then the other idea is that, a lot of, I mean, according to Dario Amodei, who is the CEO of Anthropic, we may be several years away from, basically almost all human labor being replaceable by artificial intelligence. They're seeing artificial general intelligence coming in like 3 years, where you can have agents who certainly could take care of all of the knowledge work, but then right beyond that is artificial superintelligence, which will be able to build, robots that can actually take care of all of the physical work. So, but in this period of time where we're going to see the disenfranchisement of a lot of knowledge workers, and we're already seeing cuts in Meta and technology companies and software and graphic design and music, there's et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there could be the possibility of a kind of self-identity of a movement of people who are sort of part of the knowledge worker class, and recognizing that the outcome of this direction of techno-feudalism is going to be, very, very bad if it isn't changed. And the fork in the road. I mean, even Sam Altman, and I just wrote about this today in my newsletter, a few years ago ran a UBI kind of like test program in Texas, and they found that giving people $1,000 a month for 3 years completely transformed their lives in a really positive way. They weren't like squandering the money on fentanyl. They were using it to, take care of their kids and live better and have better nutrition and so on. So I think what has to be pushed for is this sort of AI dividend, as it unleashes productivity, has to go to the people as a whole. And we have to say create some kind of movement of where we where we liberate people's time and energy and attention, from this despicable mega machine, which has everybody trapped right now. And I think that could become a very popular movement if we found the right way to frame it. Now, then you have to go into what do people do? Or, as Wendell Berry said, like, what are people for? I mean, one of my favorite political essays or thought experiments is Oscar Wilde's The Soul of Man Under Socialism. It was his only attempt at a political essay. And he basically looked at a future where, he talked about how, like, the people who tended to be artists were the ones who had some family money, back in the 19th and 18th century. So they had time to kind of cultivate their unique self, their unique individuality. They had the time to think about what do they really think about, what moves them in a way, and that led to the Rilkes and the Baudelaires and all these kind of people. So but most people never get that freedom because they're trapped in this economic system. So yeah, so for Wilde, he said, eventually, if machines free people from unnecessary drudgery, you could have a society. I mean, his term for it was cultivated leisure. We can think about different ways that people can self-actualize, whether through investigations of consciousness, investigations of eroticism, investigations of self, creativity, community, participatory economics, mutual aid, all the good stuff that people are not allowed to access because of a predatory capitalist system that only values things in terms of monetary exchange. So that's where we can begin to orient ourselves. And by the way, Alex, I think you probably know this from my work, but I also look at things, both from, and admittedly, I'm a anarchist, leftist, in my heart. Like I believe, I don't think there should be billionaires. There should be a cap on wealth accumulation. I don't even ultimately think that private property is such a great idea. I'm more in the Murray Bookchin camp. He was a social ecologist. He wrote a book called The Ecology of Freedom, where kind of following Rousseau's ideas that private property was the original thing that created inequality in society. We might ultimately want to go more into a stewardship model, or a kind of usufruct model, for how physical resources are held in common. We're far from that right now, and sure, but yeah, no. So for me, there's this sort of more like material leftist framework, but then also there's this sort of esoteric and mystical side of things. I wrote a book about prophecies, and I'm interested in like spirit possession and all that type of stuff. But I try to hold both of those together. But anyway, yeah. So that I see as where a movement could emerge, on a material level, recognizing that, and then obviously we also have to reckon, which is like hilariously off the table right now, is discussing the impacts of climate change and global warming and species extinction, and how those severely threaten the continuity of human civilization, even in the next 10, 20, or 30 years. And yeah, we really need to be moving in a regenerative and participatory direction. And obviously we're going in the opposite direction right now.
Yeah, amen to that. I mean, that's if you mute yourself, Daniel, I think it might help with the echo. On the yeah, hopefully it helps. Yeah, I mean, what was coming up for me as you were speaking is, firstly, I agree that it's climate change in a sense, but it's actually our idea of what relationship is, and our lack of our sense of deep isolation in comparison to the rest of nature, that is the thing to work on. And Charles Eisenstein, I think, has written well about the over focus on climate when there's actually a much deeper, complex system at play. And there's one thing I wanted to touch on. I want to talk about Star Trek and Star Wars in a moment, but there's one thing I wanted to touch on, which is, what I think we need to move towards is a culture that what I think we need to evolve into is a culture that can genuinely embrace and move with complexity. So right now we have a culture that tries to boil down complexity into component parts, and it doesn't work because the world is increasingly complex. Evolution is a process of increasing complexity. So I think both materially and spiritually, we're going through a process of increasing complexity, which, Terence McKenna, and I think you've probably written about that, in ways as well. And so we simply cannot use the old ways of seeing and being that we've been using. And, I think a really good example is something like the rejection of wokeness in, wide swathes of American politics right now. There is very little understanding that you can simultaneously reject something and accept elements of it. And back to our point about class consciousness, I really want to see a rise in class consciousness. I think it's really fundamental to return to that, because I think it is the biggest marker of progress and equality in a society. And my concern is that the move towards class consciousness could very easily be a statement that identity and race don't matter at all. Actually, that was all bullshit. And actually what really matters is class, when in fact it all matters. It's just that some things matter in different contexts at different times more than others. So there's that. I just want to kind of that felt sort of important to express as sort of my thinking out loud. But I also just want to finish our part of the conversation on Star Trek and Star Wars, and I want to invite people both here in Zoom and in Substack to put any questions in the chat that you might have, so we can pick a few. But so I had a dinner with Yanis Varoufakis recently, and we got into a bit of a disagreement about philosophy and about idealism, right? So I'm a philosophical idealist. I believe consciousness is the fundamental reality. But people who have a more, like Yanis, who have a more Marxist perspective, are materialists in the philosophical sense. They believe that what's really real is matter, the things you can touch. And I think fundamentally one of the shifts we need to make, or the biggest shift we need to make, is away from this disconnected, isolated sense of ourselves as strangers in the world into an embodied, connected relationship with ourselves, one another, and reality, and at least some recognition that consciousness, our qualitative experience of being alive, is as real as my AirPods case, right? At least as real. I think it's more real, but if we could get to that point. And so in our conversation, we got into, we're both big Star Trek fans. I'm also a big Star Wars fan, but he doesn't like Star Wars. And I think this is a very interesting tension point where Star Trek is sort of a communist utopia, and the technology in Star Trek is all kind of hidden, right? It's like our technology now. It's sort of like, hey Alexa, but it's the computer, right? And so it's all clean, hidden, finessed. Everything is very ethical. Everything, the messiness of the human experience is not really there. Everyone's sort of very multicultural and gets on. And there's no mysticism, or there's very little. You have people like you have Q, and you have a few kind of scientific mysticism bits, right? But Star Wars, all the machinery is right in your face, embodied. There's people fixing robots. Like you kind of get a spaceship to work by smacking it. It's real. It's like physically here. It's bits connected to each other. You can kind of see it. Yeah, no bathrooms on the Enterprise, John Flatberg said, which is a really good point, right? And the other thing Star Wars has is something beyond us, the Force, right? It's got something that binds reality together that transcends the games that everyone is playing, right? There's a sacred aspect that takes people beyond themselves, and there's a sense of mystery and purpose and agency to the universe, which is totally lacking from Star Trek. So to finish this point off, like, I read a lot of sci-fi. It's pretty much the main thing I read. And Ian M. Banks, for example, he has this universe called the Culture, where intelligent, sort of benevolent AIs run everything, and people live exactly the lives that you're describing, where, you get a character who's just sort of like waiting tables, not because they need to, but just it's a cool experience. They do that for a while. You have another character who just grafts 1,000 ears onto himself so that he can just listen at a deeper level than anyone ever has. People change genders at will, It's this kind of very hedonistic thing. And it doesn't appeal to me. I want to move towards a future that's messy, that's beautiful, but also messy, and that has kind of some chaos in it. So I thought the last thing I wanted to ask you about was maybe just to share, what is the kind of future that you personally would hope for us collectively? Like, what gets you like excited, inspired in your kind of, more wild imaginings? You're on mute, Daniel, at least on this side. Yep.
Okay, thank you for sharing that, Alex. Yeah, I used to be a big science fiction reader. I can't really read novels anymore. I just feel like life has become this like, psychedelic dystopian thriller in a way. Like it's hard to focus on other fictions in a way for that long. But yeah, so I mean, when I was researching my first books, Breaking Open the Head and 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, I started as a scientific materialist, skeptic, rationalist. And I had, all sorts of psychic and paranormal experiences and supernatural experiences. And I didn't really believe that these things were possible. But then they happened to me over and over again. Then I began to study and read, and I got very fascinated with like say Carl Jung and Rudolf Steiner, who I kind of see as the two great like 20th century like Western shamans. In fact, if people are interested, I'm doing a seminar on Steiner next month, liminal.news, which is my course platform. So I think there's like there probably are many dimensions of reality. And what we now know of the universe is just a tiny fraction. Like our senses have just been, kind of shaped, and our brain mind system is basically oriented, towards survival at this point. But yeah, I mean, evolutionary pressures in that sense have shaped it. Like you, I'm also an idealist. I'm a big fan of Bernardo Kastrup's work. Steiner also was a monistic idealist. His first book, Philosophy of Freedom, was a really profound refutation of Kantian dualism and offered a complete basis, a grounded basis for his later esoteric and occult philosophy. So I feel that I'm not really a fan of the sort of transhumanist singularity kind of chip in the brain kind of direction, or the Mars direction. I feel that we really don't even know how incredible life could be here on Earth, and we're forfeiting so much that's just like, beyond our capacity at this point, out of ignorance and stupidity, and because psychopaths are leading us astray. So for instance, I recommend this movie called Tuktum, Between Worlds, which is about these Tibetan monks who, if they meditate for 30 years, when they pass away, they maintain themselves in a lotus position, and they're even though they no longer have breath or pulse, their bodies are maintained in their traditional lifelike form. And there were scientists who did research on them. This could be like 5, 6 weeks after they died. Um, and according to how they understand it in the Tibetan tradition, they're maintaining themselves in a subtle consciousness state, in the sort of near nirvana state, and actually choosing their next incarnation. And so the Tibetans have a huge, very developed science of reincarnation with their tulkus and lamas. Rudolf Steiner said actually that his mission on Earth was to bring the knowledge of reincarnation back to the West. He talked about nature spirits, other subtle dimensions, other worlds that we could access. So, another way of looking at it is there's a book called The Psychedelic Future of the Mind by Dr. Tom Roberts, where he talked about, we could actually be orienting towards the deep exploration of consciousness for those who want to have those experiences. And we can use technology to augment or assist in our discoveries. But I know you did the DMT research at Imperial College. But even that, I mean, I'm also past the hyper focus on psychedelics. I think there's so many ways that we can extend the range of our consciousness or have different types of experience. I've been going to ISTA, International School of Temple Arts, which is kind of like a Western neo-tantra school, and I'm fascinated by how eros can be utilized to move into different consciousness states. Or I don't know, there's just I feel like, or the Shipibo and their use of different plants or dietas, where the plants actually impart wisdom and bring people into different subtle states of consciousness and visit them in their dreams and so on. I just don't know why we're rushing to eliminate reality in this techno monomania, when there's so much more that's available for us in the sensuous world that we haven't even touched on yet. Like we're actually at a kindergarten level in terms of what we could explore. And yeah, I mean, and some of this technology could be very enabling. If we could stop now and be like, okay, like we got to this point, but this is a runaway train, and this kind of merger of capitalist economics and exploitation and domination, with increasingly destructive technologies that impact our cognitive space, that rewire the brain in certain ways. Like, kids who grow up using, navigations on smartphones, won't even be able to, they'll do permanent damage to the hippocampus, so there won't even be the capacity to spatially navigate. And I already see that with young people. Like we're on this, we're on this like runaway freight train of technology. Nobody that I know like demanded, an AI takeover of society. We're being, we're being forced into this. We're being forced onto this high-speed train to nowhere. And that's why what we would need is a kind of multitude, citizenish movement, of awareness, bringing in, no longer, kind of othering, religious people or indigenous people or, any people, like sort of like building a movement that, coherently opposes, this thing that's underway. And then, yeah, maybe we could have a much more amazing world. And then eventually, we can explore the stars, or the inner stars or the inner cosmos, but that's how I would see the future. Like this is like our final exam that it looks like we're about to fail. But until I breathe my last breath, I will still be trying to see if there's a way to do something different.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we perform best when under pressure, which is something Terence McKenna used to talk about as well. He also used to say, we've had whatever 100,000 years of the human experience, and we better not drop the ball. We're the generation that's holding the ball, and like every other generation, we've got to pass it on. So that always gives me hope and energy. So we're going to open up to some questions, and we will try this is for the first time. Before, when we did this on Instagram, we turned off the live feed, but we've got some questions from the Substack, so we're going to ask some questions. Yeah, and I might be giving an echo now, so I will keep this quick. to so that's not too annoying for people on the Substack. Sorry, guys, I don't know why we're getting the echo. It doesn't really make sense. But the Julius Gunter in the Zoom, you had a great question about UFOs, which we would love to hear if you are up for unmuting yourself and asking.
Hey, I'm actually Julius Günther's wife, so I'm gonna try to rephrase this question because he's not in the room right now. So he's very interested in the UAP UFO phenomena, and he was just wondering how this the plays into all of this entire discussion that these things are becoming more visible in the mainstream media and all of that. So yeah, I think he just wanted to know yeah, how you saw what your
Great,
opinion.
thank you. That's really useful. And so, just for everyone in the Substack, the question was from Julius Gunter's wife, who is online, but Julius isn't at the moment. But it was around the UFO UAP phenomena, and what exactly that's representing right now. What we make of that. So Daniel, do you want to kick us off with that?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I've written about that a lot. In my second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, I have about 100 pages, actually, mainly on UFOs, but mainly on the crop circles, those patterns that appeared that still appear in fields around the world, but particularly in the UK. And I was lucky enough to get to visit them kind of during the heart of that phenomenon, like 2000. Maybe 2000, yeah, 2003. Yeah, so I did a huge amount of research and very humbly, I would say that, the conclusion of my research is that those things are not all being made by farmers or bored artists or whatever. And there is some type of communication that's been happening in an ongoing way between us and another level or form of consciousness, which could be us in the future, could be us in another dimension, could be something else. It could, it's yeah, and so that communication, obviously I could spend like 2 hours, and I have given talks about it, really going into the different levels of it and what it seems to be, trying to teach us around kind of the bridging between like ancient indigenous wisdom and modern technologies and science and kind of patterns and symbol and all sorts of stuff. When I wrote that book, which was 2002, I think no 2007, I guess. I'd assumed that yeah, there'd be more interest in studying that in a kind of non-biased way, but actually it's still pretty much in the arena of marginal or rejected knowledge at this point. So yeah, and I've talked to many people who have extraordinary experiences. I was at a party last week, and somebody talked about this alien being appearing in the house, disappearing like smoke, reappearing, and I was just like listening. A lot of times when people tell me these stories, I listen to the tonality of how they speak and how they're expressing and their own, and in this case, I felt that this person was just simply telling me, directly what happened to him. Um, so yeah, and of course, from the perspective of somebody who's had different psychic, paranormal, and supernatural experiences, I have a larger framework for thinking that some of this is meaningful. But then, how do you obviously understand and interpret it? And obviously, there's a lot going on there. I've been finding myself more suspicious recently as it's become part of the sort of right wing kind of like disinformation mechanism, with these like drones and so on that have been appearing in the US. I don't know, there's something about the tonality of the way it's being pursued right now. And the problem is that we're so literal minded as, modern Westerners and so dualistic in our thinking that something is like, alien or human or, kind of, a cloud or UFO. I mean, one arena of thinking about this area that for me was very helpful was Patrick Harpur's work. He wrote a book called The Philosopher's Secret Fire, and I think he's actually one of the most profound modern thinkers, and also somebody who's really not very well studied or understood. And so he talks about how, from an indigenous perspective, let's say, or sort of ancient culture perspectives, we're sort of trapped in this like this sort of literalism and linearity and dualism, and for them, like he quotes, I guess, Sallust, a classical writer, that kind of mythical events are kind of like not real or unreal. They kind of like they always have existed in some way, and in some way they never have existed. And yeah, and so this idea that we have a literal body that's separate from the imaginal or the astral or the dream body, indigenous cultures from their experience don't really see it like that. There's like a blending or a boundary or a merging. Yeah, I mean, in fact, one of the concepts, I mean, both when I deal with people like Rudolf Steiner, and I've written a lot about prophecies, looking at the Mayan and the Hopi and the Aztec prophecies, and it's not like trying to like build like a completely new like ironclad ideology or belief system, but it's like, making use of different conceptual frameworks to help orient and maybe like shape, how I understand and think about the world, and maybe it helps others too. But there's a Toltec shaman, Sergio Magana, who wrote a book called the Dawning of the Age of the Sixth Sun. And he talks about how from the Toltec and Aztec perspective, we're moving from the fifth to the sixth sun, and that these different ages for them are really about different forms of consciousness. And the age that we're leaving was a sun of light. And in that time, the predominant tonality or focus of human consciousness was kind of waking, clarity, empiricism, rational thought, quantification, and so on. And as we enter a sixth sun, which is characterized as a sun of darkness, the predominant quality and tonality of consciousness is changing. It's becoming more dreamlike, more unconscious, more like the psychic realm. So the material reality is more and more permeated by the psychic and the subtle. And I actually do kind of feel that is a very interesting, mapping for certain things that we see happening, even in terms of how AI is confusing our capacity to distinguish, fake from real, true from deceptive, and so on. It feels like we're moving into a different, kind of polarity of awareness in a way. And so, yeah, so, and, that also somehow relates to this, this sort of tends to be inherently demonic or trickster-like phenomena of the UFOs, which always seem to, hover right on the liminal edge, where they sort of come down towards us, and we think there's going to be this huge breakthrough, and we're going to see the bodies and the videos of the interrogations. Then it sort of swims away again. It's like I think we have to sort of think about it almost like phenomenologically as this phenomena which has this intrinsic quality of like not quite being here or there, almost like a quantum phenomenon that just hovers on the boundary of our reality. And it's not clear to me it will ever come, or at least in our lifetimes, more into focus than that. So that's my kind of effort and answer.
Amazing answer, man. And it's funny because my entire laptop crashed on the Zoom through the entirety of the answer, but I was able to hear it on the Substack. So I'm now back. And yeah, would love to. Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. And I think it's this trickstery quality of the UFO phenomena, like you just mentioned, where it's sort of unclear that there's a kind of very liminal aspect to it. I think Carl Jung is one of the best frames, or the best thinkers on this. And, Jung, there's very fascinating phenomena that Graham Hancock and others have talked about, where our abduction experiences used to be related to spirits of the land and, fairies and entities in the world. And then once our technology changed, they became related to machines, sort of nuts and bolts machines. And actually, my friend Dave Luke, who's a parapsychologist, he's pointed out to me that, people would see UFOs, like, have UFO experiences in like the 60s or 70s, and the UFOs would have nuts and bolts bolting the plates together like we do, So there's this kind of sense in which I think the phenomena is a real psychic phenomena, but I think our projection of it is our projection. Yeah? Can you, Daniel? Yeah? Oh, hold on.
So I wanted to make one other point, which has been one of my sort of bailiwicks right now. So a thinker that I think is profoundly also underappreciated in a contemporary way, along with Patrick Harper, which I really feel everybody should read, The Philosopher's Secret Fire. It's such an incredible book. But do you know Watson? He wrote coming in that book. He has an essay where he talks about kind of like the demonic realm, and he talks about how, and this was back in the 90s. He was sort of, and I guess he was sort of an Indian mystic or Sufi or something, but he was talking about how like he was concerned that the unrestricted use of psychedelics plus the, more intensive use of electronic and digital technologies and virtual technologies were actually leading to a kind of dissolving of the boundary between the psychic and the physical, which was actually allowing beings and in some cases lower beings or demonic beings from the psychic to leak more into the physical and the material world. And to be honest with you, as somebody who helped launch the psychedelic movement with my first book, Breaking Open the Head, as that movement has gone on, I feel more and more concerned that it's actually hasn't been as much of a positive as I had hoped, and that actually we've underestimated, because a lot of the framing of the psychedelic movement has been hyper literal and scientific. Like if you go to the Horizon Festival or MAPS, it's all about scientific evidence and does the data say that this helps obsessive compulsive disorder or heal PTSD. But there's been a kind of like schism or like repression of this sort of esoteric layer of like spirit, like you would talk about like spirit possession in a scientific context or any of this stuff. And more when and it's like, I try to look at the world phenomenologically in a way, but it's like, and see the whole thing as like a whole tactile unity. But there's something about how much psychedelics have been used in festivals and, with different intentions by different people in the West, and maybe don't even know what they're doing. And I myself at times in this, I think psychedelics really, sort of messed me up in some ways for a while. But have we actually, accidentally sort of triggered more of this erosion between the psychic and the physical because we didn't even know there was a psychic, And does that movement also need? This is what I was going to talk to you about, maybe seeing if I could talk about this at Breaking Convention. Does that movement actually need to kind of like take stock of itself and be like, okay, like maybe this whole scientific medical trajectory is inherently problematic, and there is a realm of beings from different worlds who are using our kind of like unlearned, unlineaged use of these substances to like piggyback into this reality in a way that's actually causing all sorts of unhealthy or destructive effects.
Yeah, I think that's a
Anyway, I just
very
put that
key
out.
point. And the I mean, another way to frame that, the question of are all these all the entities or energies coming and kind of breaching into our psyche, you could look at that as is our collective unconscious, which hasn't been fully expressed and needs to be felt. Are there aspects archetypally that are pushing out and need to be processed and understood by the conscious mind or the collectively conscious mind and move through? Like, Jung talked about, Jung had there's this great conversation between Jung and a protege of his after he came back from a trip to New York in the 50s. And he says, like, walking around New York, he's like, what happened to the dragon? What happened to that archetypal energy in the landscape, which was transformative and destructive and dangerous? And his argument was that it got projected into our machines. We projected all that psychic energy into our machines, and now they contain all of that. And I think he's right about that. And I think there's, I had just had a conversation for our upcoming documentary, Crossroads, with Josh Schry, who does the Emerald podcast. And he said something really, I mean, he always says many great things, but, he was pointing out that a lot of indigenous cultures who are used to going into other worlds have very clear foundations and practices to boundary themselves. That it's like, hey, you know what? Not every entity gets in. Not everything is trustworthy. I'm boundaried. Whereas we're going into the internet constantly and we're effectively trapped in each other's minds. We're going constantly into this collective unconscious of each other and just bombarded by this. I see this in psychedelic therapy as well, this kind of scientific clinical trial settings. They haven't a clue about psychic energies. They're trying to put everything into a box, and then you get all these kind of energy spreading through the teams, and just like it really breaks the scientific paradigm as we understand it. I'm not anti-science, but I think there's something in that. And so I think we are living in this age of, and the UFO phenomena, to get back to that, I think it may well be real. I don't know. I'm also curious about psyops and whether it's nuts and bolts, whether we have anti-grav technology. I'm fascinated by the whole question, but I think it's at the same time, whatever's going on, a psychic phenomena of our collective projection. And as an idealist, I think that can be as real as matter as well. So it doesn't make it less real, but it gives us a different frame on it. Yeah, like as Kalima's saying, a both and. So let's go to another question while we've got some time. We might go slightly over today if you're up for that, Daniel, because there's a lot of people in the Substack, and we had a few tech issues. But actually, Kalima.
No, I'm very excited to have this conversation, and yeah, just in terms of the young stuff, you were sort of touching on that. But yeah, his last book was actually about the flying saucer myth, and from an archetypal perspective, he actually did believe we were coming close to what he talked about as the archetype of the apocalypse. His follower Edward Edinger wrote a beautiful book, Archetype of the Apocalypse, and Jung thought that the round shape of the saucers was actually a symbol of a psychic wholeness, and they pointed towards the sort of end product of the apocalypse as a process of revealing or uncovering, leading to a kind of integration of the psyche, the psychic wholeness, where all of the dark and shadowy elements of the psyche and all of the beautiful and sort of elevated aspects could be integrated and contained by the individual, and the collective.
That's very cool. I like that. I think that's a very useful frame. So Daniel, if you mute for a second, because we're getting echo on the Substack, and just Substackers, just checking. I think I've changed something, so I'm hoping you're not getting an echo from me now. Just let me know in the chat, because we're testing this out, so it's good to know. So Kalima, you had a really nice question about the counterculture and the role of a charismatic narrative in the counterculture. I wondered if you might like to unmute and ask that, and Nico has very helpfully put that in the chat.
Well, I just have been watching over a kind of oh, first of all, just thank you guys both so much. This is just exponentially amazing for me. I've been watching this for some long period of time, and I see little bits and pieces and fragments happening here and there of people inspired by a certain idea or going off in a certain direction, but I don't see the integrative. I don't see the integrative story yet, and that's what I'm wondering about. Whether we're all kind of sitting on the edge of our chairs, waiting for some really cogent narrative to emerge that everybody just says, "Yes, I want to do that," or "I want to be that," or "I want to participate in that." And I think what you guys are doing is right on the cusp of it, because you're collecting large followings over a diverse population and diverse areas. And I guess it's probably still Western, but I can easily see it, going into more of a global, but that's what it seems to me. Would you guys speak to that? I think that's kind of what I see as really a crucial element right now.
Just going to repeat the question for people in Substack. Thank you, Klima. It's a great one. So the question was, what's the role of a sort of like a kind of charismatic narrative that we can globally rally around? Because it seems it's really quite dispersed right now, and I think that's a very interesting one. So Daniel, do you want to kick us off on that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Cool. I mean, there was a time years ago where I was Mr. 2012, so I was really excited about that as the charismatic narrative that I hoped could be used as a focusing lens. And I mean, I had never, I wasn't arguing that anything necessarily was going to happen on December 21st, 2012. And we made a documentary, 2012 Time for Change, where we proposed that it could be an opportunity to reconsider indigenous knowledge systems, to recognize that, the sort of destructive, particularly the environmentally destructive aspects of post-industrial capitalism needed to be addressed through tactics like permaculture, bioremediation, local currencies, and all that stuff. So, we tried, I really did try to marshal a charismatic narrative, what I thought was the good. It's not, I don't think it's something you can. So it's hard to, I mean, I guess they did it with QAnon, but that was billions of dollars in dark money, going into PSYOP research, and by the way, I mean, to understand how we got into this disaster in the US, a very useful book is Jane Mayer's Dark Money, where she goes back to the 60s and looks at how the Koch brothers really recognized that they wanted to change society in a different direction and that this was going to be a long-term effort. And, that they sort of mapped it out over decades. Like you would need to build academic departments. You would need to have thinkers like Charles Murray, who wrote the Bell Curve, to kind of like, anyway, yada, yada. So I don't know how we get to a charismatic narrative at this point. At the moment, I'm very enthusiastic by this new essay by Paul Kingsnorth, which sort of posits, the original teachings of Christ against this ideology of Christian civilization, which people like Jordan Peterson and Kevin Roberts from Heritage Foundation are trying to sort of like, amp up and kind of make the new thing for civilization. I wonder if there's something there where you're just how ludicrous what they're offering is compared to the original teachings of Christ, which were about, giving away what you got, sharing, you're not going to, rich man has the chance of a camel getting through a needle to get to the kingdom of heaven. Like, they've completely perversely reversed like every teaching in that thing. And they're doing exactly the opposite, even leading me to speculate in a recent piece whether Trump, I mean, you could say these guys represent Antichrist energy. I mean, Peter Thiel loves to talk about Antichrist and gives all this lectures. And for him, Antichrist is liberal humanism and social service nets, the idea that you try to help the poor parts of the population and give them better education for them is like the malevolent thing they're trying to get rid of. But I think that potentially there's a war on that level that could be fought where we reoccupy the original gestalt of Christ's ethos and message and kind of work from there. But it's not going to sound like a counterculture of the past. In that, I mean, one thing that's happened very I find it kind of sad, but I'm like, the sort of rebellious energy of the liberal or radical counterculture of the 60s has been sucked out and sort of co-opted by the far right. So now Joe Rogan and the comedians in Austin, they've got the far right energy. It's like, the far right is like, white supremacism is like punk rock and Dadaism right now, unfortunately. And, and as Alex said, this whole wrong direction of cancel culture and identity politics and wokeism has really made it very has created a very weak scenario where so many people in the liberal intelligentsia who've gone through the academic institutions over the last decades have been in the thrall of this victimization ideology, which is it's really kind of like doesn't get them ready for resisting something serious at all. So yeah, I think in a way that would be the nucleus of something, would be the going really back to the origins of the Gnostic Gospels, Christ consciousness. What does that actually mean? Let's but nobody wants that, as Kingsnorth aptly describes in this piece, because it is kind of like martyrdom and sacrifice too. It's like going against the things of the world. It's like being willing to sacrifice everything for the kingdom of God, and that's not really on the table for most people right now.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting, lots of interesting points. I mean, my sense of the beginnings of an answer in your question, Klima, of where do we go for let's say maybe a narrative that binds many of us or enough of us together to come to some kind of coherence and forward motion to get to a more beautiful world. There's two aspects of it for me. One is nature. And by that, I mean, I think there's a universal set of relationships that all of us share, which is to the world and to nature, right? And so I think that is a transcendent ideal in the same way, I guess it was for the Romantic poets and the romantic artists who would see, immerse themselves in nature and have an experience of awe, which is an experience that sort of shreds you open. And Francois Lyotard, who was one of like the architects of what would become postmodernity, he said that this whole endeavor of like deconstructing everything so that everything is hyper relative and truth itself is relative, it's going to drive us completely insane unless we have the sublime. And the sublime is that moment that transcends language, where we realize that actually our perspective is a much smaller piece of a much wider system. And so you get that from encountering nature. The most beautiful example is the overview effect, which is what some astronauts reported from seeing the Earth from space, which I think is perfect for the Western psyche, because it doesn't matter how big your ego is. You look at the Earth from space and you have a sense of simultaneously your smallness in comparison to it, but it doesn't challenge Western individualism. It doesn't mean you're not special. It doesn't mean you don't have a unique perspective. It just means it's not that important, right? It's very different than Western people coming to Eastern philosophy and trying to erase themselves, which I think is a completely pointless endeavor. So there is that kind of experience comes from an embeddedness in nature. So that's on the bigger, I guess, metaphysical, spiritual scale. And then on the social scale, I think a return to class consciousness that moves beyond Marxism. So it's like, what is the next Marxism? Like, what is the next piece? What is the next understanding of fairness, power, capital, how it functions in society that isn't Marxism? Because that was for the 20th century. I think we need a new version of that. And I think if we could combine those two, and also because Marxism is so hyper materialist, it can't understand the idea of a nature that talks to you, speaks to you. Yeah. So Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think also what you mentioned before about idealism, and I very much recommend that people read Bernardo Kastrup's why materialism is baloney and dreamed up reality, and also he has a lot of great videos and lectures on YouTube. So it's like if we really were to root ourselves in this foundational kind of understanding that consciousness is the underlying reality, I think it's very liberating and creates a lot more potential and possibility for humanity on many levels. And yeah, because we have to sort of like, let's say the New York Times consciousness, right? Like, right after the weekend that Trump got elected, they had a sort of typical op-ed in the paper about sort of like meaninglessness and how really ultimately means nothing, from a scientific perspective. And, it's like, wow, it's like that creates such a fear, because if you really believe that this is the only thing there is, then of course your life is everything to you. And, you would never be willing, even if it's dictatorship and you're going to be stripped of all of your values and everything, like you're not willing to really fight that to the extent that it would threaten you. So from the idealism perspective, maybe there's a way to develop something that's even beyond faith, which is sort of like a certainty, around there being a metaphysical world, and even we can't, even if it maintains its mystery, that there's something more. There's we're not just accidental byproducts of a purely coincidental process, from the black holes to this point. I feel that also could have a political ramification, social ramification. We actually have a think tank, the elevator.earth. And we found a wonderful new executive director who's this incredible South African woman, Ashanti Kuneni, from a Zulu background, who's now our ED. I'd love to introduce you to her, and Alex, at some point, maybe you do a conversation with her if you want. So we're sort of seeing the linkage between Ubuntu philosophy, which is interdependence and sort of like their version of interbeing, and idealism, and those things coming together, maybe providing a basis for kind of a movement in a new direction,
Yeah, beautiful. I love that. I love the combination, and I think probably that's also maybe an important part of the answer, is that this is one of the reasons that while I have a lot of respect for Christianity and was raised Catholic, the tendency for public intellectuals to be converting to Christianity is one that I have no problem with, but for me personally, it's not my route, because I think there's a way to combine the expansive, multiple perspectives that we have on the sacred, and allow them all to exist with a greater sense of coherence with each other. I don't think we need to revert ourselves back into previous modes. It just does. It's just, for me personally, it's not my jam, basically. Yeah. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. However, I also feel that a lot of us, and my dad was an Irish Catholic, and he became an abstract painter in New York. He rejected that. Like, we're still coming out of that culture. If we're sort of Western liberal elites, where our parents or grandparents, fervently rejected for the most part those religious heritages. So yeah, it becomes hard. And yeah, as you say, there's a movement now with different public thinkers like Kingsnorth or others we can think of who've re-embraced Christianity, but it feels a little bit like a short circuit somehow. I don't completely, it's hard for me to completely appreciate it. However, for me, once again, Rudolf Steiner, and as I mentioned, I'm developing this course on him for next month. But he saw himself as an esoteric Christian, and for me, he had a very interesting way of, because obviously, with all of the energy around Christ, all the churches, all the monuments, all the paintings, like there was something happened there, which for the Western psyche was of tremendous importance. And so for Steiner, Christ's incarnation was a kind of divine expression, and for him, what it was about was kind of like the purpose of. I mean, it's going to be a lot to talk about in this particular call, but that it was about kind of like the full expression of the individuality, like this is the epoch where kind of we were developing our individual perspective, our autonomy, our separation from the group in a way. And Christ, was actually the fulfillment of that and the necessary spur for humanity to keep evolving in a certain sense. I mean, Steiner also talked about a being that would incarnate. And once again, as I was saying with, the Toltec prophecies, it's not like I'm saying believe in Steiner, but it's a very useful and interesting model. But he talked about in this time, there would also be an incarnation of a kind of metaphysical principle or being that he talked about as Ahriman, which kind of represented, technology, rationality, kind of like pure calculative thought. And I think with artificial intelligence, with people like Elon Musk, with artificial, autonomous artificial general intelligence, building bodies for itself through robots, through biotech, we're actually kind of seeing this incarnation of Ahriman that Steiner talked about. And he also had ideas about, what happens to humanity as a result. He didn't think this was something we could prevent, but it was about developing the proper orientation towards this and other events that, where the mythological and the historical kind of like meet and fuse in a way.
Awesome. Thank you. Dan. Yeah, that's really cool. And that seems like something worth diving into. I feel sort of inclined to, I haven't really delved into Steiner's work properly, but like that seems quite apt. So we're going to draw to a close. We're going to do one last piece. We've already gone a bit over, but it's been a great conversation. So it's felt very kind of alive and good to do that. But I thought we could end, Daniel, because this series of conversations is really got this overarching question of where do we go next. I have no, I'm so sorry, everyone, I was on mute. So on this Substack, so much complexity of just like different buttons. My laptop is just like covered with the cables coming out of it. But yeah, so we're going to draw to a close in a few minutes. But the last question I wanted to look at was the overarching question of all of this conversation series, which is where do we go next? There's no real, I have no conceit that, through this sort of like 10 conversations in these like opening series of Kainos, we're going to come up with an answer to that. But I do think it's realistic that we can start to map out some paths. So that's the question I thought we could leave with, Daniel. And maybe you could answer first, just on a very practical level right now in this time of transition, upheaval, uncertainty, we're in a world between worlds. What are some of the steps you think are worth taking? What are some of the directions that you think are worth exploring or moving towards for all of us, wherever we might be?
That's a nice big juicy question to cogitate on. Well, I mean, I did spend 10 years working on a book called How Soon Is Now, which was an effort that that took a lot out of me to kind of like address the civilizational question. And in that book, I was looking at like at a meta systemic level. So I was kind of like almost like pretending I was like an alien being on like a moon of Saturn, like looking at the evolution of these like funny little critters like human beings on Earth and where we've gotten to and where we would need to go from here. So some of that came out in 2016. Sting wrote a prologue for it, and the unfortunate Russell Brand wrote like an introduction before he became a right-wing, neo-Nazi fruitcake Christian again. But yeah, so I mean, there's the personal and kind of community level, and I'm not an expert on that. I'm an urban bohemian. I live ensconced in New York City. I've never grown a potato or a vegetable to save my life, but I would, so I don't feel really in a place to like recommend this, but I think people are well served if they're beginning to build communities that have some of their own like services, particularly in the US, like whether it's growing some of their own food, making some of their own energy. I mean, it does look like these guys are in the US are going to go for broke in terms of, probably breaking the economic system because they think that'll serve their long-time interest, making it as difficult as possible for communities to get, aid and assistance with natural disasters and so on. So, there is a model. There's a Christopher Botch wrote a book called LSD and the Mind of the Universe. And, once again, it's another model or an idea or scheme. I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, but he had a whole series of prophetic downloads in high dose LSD where he saw a period of breakdown, a lot of death, a lot of destruction. But then within that, these kind of new networks forming, new mycelial networks of connection, becoming the sort of the interstitial layer of a new cultural paradigm, a new authentic culture that emerged out of the wreckage. So I hold that out as an interesting hope and possibility. I am very concerned about the the possibility that the ecological crisis could become way worse than I mean, it's like we're already seeing it, moving faster than the most dire projections. And, if we go to 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels in the next 10 or 15 years, a lot of agriculture will cease to function. We'll see a lot of populations on the move. I mean, I tend to think that, the U.S. efforts to, kind of threaten Greenland and Canada are actually based on, some like strategic planning around like where you're going to put the people. We just had L.A. go up in flames. We just had North Carolina break down. There's going to be billions of people pushing up from the global south. I mean, apparently Canada could hold 2 billion people. Particularly as things get warmer there and the land becomes more arable. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I'm talking to even people from the Rand Corporation who've kind of like gamified this kind of stuff out. There's a lot of big things underway underneath the surface. Maybe we're not seeing, all of it so clearly. So on the one hand, there's creating new networks or rebuilding networks of community, building communities, for those people who feel compelled in that direction. I would never speak for everybody, but I also think there's the possibility to kind of like re-inhabit the sphere of the virtual and build something like social networks that are trust-based, where people have to be themselves, where, news is evidence-based. I mean, a big problem we have in the US, and I'm sure other places also, is the decimation of local news and local journalism. And a lot of that, unfortunately, was called by Google and their ad platforms, which basically took all of the revenue out of the local news services, local newspapers, and decimated that whole business model. But so is there a way that if you had a network where local people began to have a trustworthy voices and leadership from within, and maybe voting systems for posts where they could actually look at what's happening locally. Community assemblies could be an interesting part of that. So I think we need like a outside of the Facebook, Twitter ecosystem, just sort of a new, social media, social networking platform that, is trustworthy and isn't going to be skewed so easily. So those are kind of my thing. And then, and then I'm interested in conscious exploration, magic. Like, I think the universe is basically, magic and everything. I'm as a sort of Dzogchen, tantric anthroposophist, Yeah, I think it's samsara is nirvana. However it unfolds, it's all perfect. And in a way, we just have to surrender into the inherent perfection, even of things that seem kind of terrible or destructive in the short term. I like the stories of the Tibetan monks who were in prison for decades in Chinese prisons and came out laughing. Said the hardest part of that experience for them was maintaining compassion all the time for their guards. So, even the worst situation can be the best situation when it comes to evolving our inner being and our capacity.
Yeah, amen to that. I think that's a really beautiful point. And yeah, my response to that question, it kind of, I guess, picks up from there a little bit, is we live in a world right now which is the result of a really necessary shift about 500 years ago during the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, to be able to take a step back from the world and observe it and understand our own the self-deception inherent in our own subjectivity, and be able to see the world as a disparate, unconnected pieces that we could analyze. We have spaceships now, we have this technology, so great. But I think that has now run its course, and it's slipped into the mode where it's become self-annihilating. Because, and this is told in our stories over and over and over again. This is, I think the code of stories that people like Christopher Booker or Joseph Campbell or Jung pointed out, that when you have a situation where we're disconnected from the world and we're isolated and we're trapped in our own egotism, what happens is destruction and annihilation, and everything around us dies. So in a tragedy, the character never escapes from that. And you have someone like Macbeth or Hamlet who just cannot escape from this kind of core wound that they have. And in a comedy, usually you have two people in love, and there's someone standing in their way because of their own egotism. And then eventually what happens is that they see the error of their ways. And I think collectively we're in this kind of process right now, where we're in a collective process where, certainly in the West, but I would say more broadly, capitalist, high-tech, first world countries, we've become trapped in our own minds, and we've become trapped in our own egotism. And so the best frame I found for this, and this is a little bit downstream from I think the very useful, practical examples you gave, Daniel. So I want to kind of just caveat that I think is absolutely essential we have both. I don't think philosophy is going to save everything. I think action and impact is essential, and policy as well. But I think underneath that, I have this idea that reality eats culture for breakfast, because there's this phrase in business, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And fundamentally, I think we need to return to an orientation towards the quality of our lived experience as human beings, rather than the quantity of things we can produce, or time that we can use well, or how we can maximize our lifespan, or how we can maximize our experience. And Robert Pirsig talked about this in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And I think there's a reason that's the best-selling philosophy book of all time, because it's such a simple move to go, what does it mean to orient towards the quality of my experience right now, and to orient towards the quality of experience in general as the primary indicator of what I should do, or what we should all do with our time. It shifts it, because what it shifts it into is a return to a kind of subjectivity that we lost. And I think for me, it's absolutely essential, because the deep contradiction is that we live increasingly isolated, techno-feudal, lonely, cut off lives. And there's no point living lives like that, right? Like, we're living to go on living like that. And so I think there's a deeper shift into connecting to a sense of being here, and being with one another, connecting with one another, being immersed in the world, being connected to the world. It's quite a broad answer, really, but I think that's a place to start. And what I'm curious about specifically is, how can our art start to reflect that? How can our theories start to reflect that? How can policy start to reflect that? Like, even the Gross National Happiness Index in Bhutan is a nice start. It's kind of, it's been around for a while, but it's a lovely idea. It's like, instead of GDP, what we're supposedly producing, what if countries measured the level of qualitative connection in a society? Because wouldn't we want to strive? Isn't the whole point of GDP the pursuit of happiness, quote unquote? which is a mad phrase. Sorry to our American friends and you, Daniel, if you ascribe to it. I'm sure perhaps you don't, but it's a mad addictive kind of phrase. I don't know. Let's see. Do you ascribe to the pursuit of happiness?
Strangely enough, I am quite happy. I don't need to anymore. I somehow found it. I don't even know how that happened, but it's weird. It's weird.
Nice. Well, I'm glad you're happy. That's a lovely place to end. I'm hoping everyone else is happy. Who's we'll do some final thoughts, Daniel. But I'm hoping everyone else is happy as well. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you for being experimental guinea pigs on our very first, both Daniel and my very first ever Substack Live. Really lovely to see such a big turnout. Ellen, yes, all paid members will get the recording. Everyone else will get one a little bit later. You guys will get it pretty soon. If you want to tune into these conversations in the future, not all of them are streamed live, but Nico, maybe you could post in the Substack chat the post that includes what conversations we have coming up. So, Daniel, any final closing thoughts before we say goodbye?
I'm going to be irritatingly self-promotional because we have so many people on the Substack. It's so exciting. Please, guys, join my Substack, danielpinchbeck.substack.com. Send me a message. I'm really curious how this conversation went down for you. Daniel.pinchbeck@gmail.com. Pinchbeck is my last name. And I hope we get a chance to do more. This seems to be a very active channel on Substack right now. It feels that people are really looking for something worth listening to and talking about. So I think I'm excited to do more here. And Alex, really thank you so much for hosting this. I loved it. And thanks for everybody who listened attentively with your glasses and your interiors and your friendly faces. And I hope we all get to meet again.
Absolutely, Daniel. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this a lot. And so let's do our collective goodbyes on Zoom. Unmute ourselves, say thanks to Daniel, and goodbye.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, everyone. Substack.
Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel and Alice.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Very helpful. Really good. Very good insights.